Hello, welcome to The Future is a Mixtape. I'm Jesse.
This is Matt.
And this week we are thinking about think tanks with Matt Bruenig, the American lawyer, blogger, political analyst, and founder of People's Policy Project.
Thinking about think tanks. That's like double think. Oh, shit. But am I going to be? Am I going to be 3P curious? I think I might be 3P curious.
You might be 3P curious in this one. Another transformative episode. Another transformative discussion for Matt. And this is also doubling it up on the Matts.
So we're going to have a moment. You won't see the eye contact because it's just between laptops. So we'll be having him beamed in Star Trek Scotty size. So we'll be talking about, of course, his new People's Policy Project and what it creates in terms of a horizon, a socialist horizon.
Yes. So enjoy.
Cheers. So Matt, hi, I'm Matt. I guess we should.
It's the double Matt episode.
It is a remarkable thing when you meet another Matt. So
it's the Matt and Matt.
Exactly. So thankfully you don't have the name Snyder, which is attached to some pretty nefarious people. Zack Snyder, who makes bad films, and of course the Snyder, that's the governor of Michigan, that's poisoning people. But I was wondering, since I'm Matt and you're Matt, we had different childhoods. I was wondering, like, what were some of your original fantasies about life? What dreams did you have about the world when you were?
What did you want to be when you grew up?
When you were in this version of Mattness, what were your kind of fantasies about the world?
Yeah, well, I wanted to be a truck driver or a bus driver when I was 10 or 12 or that right. At that range. You start getting into more, practical, as like not astronauts and then that's where.
So you're interested in kind of this direct mechanical experience. So just the feeling of driving in cars is, my son's really into cars. I was too at some point, something happened, but just the aspect of driving really interested you?
Yeah. And my dad was a forklift driver and was in the trucking industry and...
Did you have a forklift truck toy? Because I want to know what your dad thought when you're playing with a forklift truck toy.
No, I don't remember having a forklift truck. I did have a dump truck at one
point. And so that was kind of your general aims, like you wanted to be a truck driver, you wanted to drive cars or vehicles. But long term, did you have an idea of what the future would look like when you were a kid? Like, how did you think people would relate to each other? And I assume you're probably more on the millennial edge. We're on the late Gen X. Are you more of a millennial?
Yeah, I'm 28.
Oh.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, you're top end of the millennial bracket, I guess, or something like that.
All right. Square in it.
Yeah, we were born in the late 70s, so we're in the tail end of that Gen X. But so I imagine, too, like our perspective and your perspective is different about what the future was. I mean, because, as our friend Kelsey Goldberg from DSA LA said, the Gen X is the ones that were on the stock market when shit was blowing up and not really protecting. Oh yeah. Millennials.
Gen X is a bunch of fucking just assholes,
apolitical opportunists, or just generally just amorphous about politics. I mean, I felt like being Gen X, there wasn't really a clear vision of politics or social change. But I think that probably speaks to maybe the fact that we're tail end Gen X, so we saw these folks come up above us.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, if you think about the 90s was a good period economically. And I graduated high school in 2007, which was the year of the Great Recession kicking off.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Wow. I was in college for all of that and then law school for we just now, I guess, gotten to the unemployment rate we used to be at before I graduated high school. So, my whole young adult life has been depressed economy.
Right. Yeah. So
wars and depressed economy. I mean, that's just perpetual war, essentially. Right?
Yeah, and we've talked about that, and we've had guests, millennial guests on the show, and we talk about that and the differences between our experiences coming of age in the early 90s, and I shared before how the experiences in the early 90s, like what happened here in LA with the Rodney King and the acquittal of 92. The LAPD cops there.
You didn't get to experience the miracle of the Ford Taurus in any visceral way like we did. The miracle of GM and Chrysler coming back in the rip-roaring 90s. I mean, it was all hollowed out. I mean, when you look back now, it's just a financialization of the stock market and outsourcing was going on and all that things. But you're on the baseline level, there were jobs created. I think the numbers were something like 22 million during the Clinton era and 5 million for Bush. So there were jobs tangibly enough from the 90s. But for you, most kids grow up playing World of Warcraft or Doctor or Hopscotch, but was there something that where politics played a role in your life early on, where you could really feel politics affecting your family or friends?
Well, yeah. I mean, I grew up with a single mother for most of my life. So I wouldn't say like political events, but just what it is to be in that situation, like single mother, 2 kids. My mom worked at a retail store, not a good material existence. And that's just a sort of perpetual thing, not driven by recessions necessarily.
Did she have a support system? Like, was she really just on her own when she was raising her kids? And you, of course.
I mean, her parents were, in the area. But that was pretty much it. I mean, for the most part, it was just us, and my dad was around, and I would go visit him and stuff. But financially, there wasn't other sources of money flowing in than paycheck, earned income tax credit, maybe food stamps here and there. So that was, I suppose, primed me a bit to being sympathetic to those issues.
Okay, and so do you think that sort of opened the doorway for you to get involved in the way that you have become involved in these issues of social welfare and stuff?
I mean, that was my background, and then when I was in high school, I was on the debate team, and you get really into political theory and stuff if you like get really into the activity, because you need to actually debate, and so you get exposed to a lot of that stuff a lot more quickly. Like the kind of stuff normally you might get exposed to in college, you get exposed to as a 15-year-old, and actually arguing and being forced to argue and defend those positions in front of judges at events and stuff. And so I kind of gravitated more towards the more left-wing political critiques and that sort of thing for that activity, and then also just generally were appealing.
Right, and your avatar on the internet, Twitter and elsewhere, is the Richard Avedon photo of John Rawls. Why is that your avatar? How's John Rawls informed your viewpoints?
It was... people wonder the significance of the avatar, and it's really not that significant. But before I had John Rawls, I had a little leaf as my avatar for some reason, and then I thought, well, I don't know, maybe I should get a pic of a philosopher, and I looked through a few, and that picture is like real striking. So.
I see a real connection with the leaf and the veil of ignorance, right? Because the leaf just doesn't know where it's going to land, right? So that was the idea of John Rawls, was the veil of ignorance. Like if you were set down on the earth somewhere, you wouldn't have any control of that, and people don't. And so I think there's a connection with the leaf. That was just a precursor.
That's true. I think actually that there was like in the WordPress theme I had, there was a leaf like design element in it, and I like, well, I should make my Twitter.
Maybe it was an idea shape, as we call it, right? So, John Rawls. Was there like a central injustice in your life that shaped you, where it was a political, moral thing that was just there in front of you, and you had to decide whether to get involved? Because you said that your childhood certainly created a lens for how you viewed politics, retrospectively, but was there some type of like central injustice, maybe more when you're a teenager or when you're an adult, that forced you to make some type of decision about?
Are you trying to dig for a defining moment there?
Yeah, the defining moment. The Wheaties, like the radical left Wheaties box.
I want to let him answer in a second, but I was like, this thing of this defining moment, I've always had this weird relationship to this narrative structure that seems the paradigmatic narrative structure that there are, because of the constraints of film as a dominant medium, you sort of imagine your life like a film, and there's these concrete turning points, and I'm like, I don't see any of those in my life.
Sociologists would say the opposite, which is that that's the structure that people make before cinema. That's you re-highlight the mechanisms that justify your current existence. So, yeah, I would say it's probably a deeper thing. But was there, to use the filmic expression as Jesse wants to call it, some central moment in your life where you had to confront politics in a visceral way?
I don't think so. I think, I was interested. I did some Iraq War stuff when I was in high school. Now I don't really do any foreign policy stuff. But that would have been my first, saying anything political. And then I went into college, and I worked on the Nader campaign the first year I was in college. And then I joined, we had a left-wing student group, and worked with them, and worked in Dennis Kucinich's office for a while I was in college. And then I worked at Jobs with Justice, and I just kind of on campus had our group during the summers, with some kind of politician or left-wing organization and just sort of develop that way. I guess, all of this was tending towards becoming a labor lawyer.
Right.
So that maybe there was some aspect of just, well, my dad was in a union for a while and we were definitely a pro-labor family. So that was, but I can't, there was no sort of striking moment. It was just kind of a day-to-day.
What about 2011 Occupy? Did you get involved at all in the Occupy movements?
Yeah, I was at Boston University at the time, and I was, when we had Occupy Boston, they had their plot of land in Dudley Square, and I was there on the first day, and I slept in the tent the first weekend, and I was a legal observer. I had my hat on and stuff, and I made the students, we had a Students Occupy Boston website just to, rally the student contingent. And I had made that website and got, admins from all the different, universities to kind of put up their page and try to coordinate and stuff.
Right.
But I don't know, Occupy really descended into a bad place pretty quickly in Boston. So it wasn't I was out there for a month, day in, day out. It was more like after a few weeks, it was really it just seemed not like a great place.
I thought, I was involved with Occupy Riverside back in 2011. So I was done with my PhD and had filed in 2008, but 2011 it started up about a week or 2 weeks after September 17th. And the two principal things I found that both exciting and also really jarring was the kind of call-out culture that would develop from a General Assembly was kind of a snare for that. And then also the inability to come up with actual real material demands. Which I think Black Lives Matter has done a better job at, of coming up with demands. And we refused to come up with demands because that required some debasement of anarchy or anarchist thinking. And I identify as an anarcho-socialist, but you have to prioritize certain things. And that was, I think, for me, that's where it was kind of falling apart.
Yeah, there was the anti-demand aspect. And then it devolved into a lot of basically internal regulation seemed to be the issue of the day. Anytime the assembly was on, it was what kind of rules can we establish for the camp, which I guess was part of their mini society theory of, we're creating our own system inside the old and that kind of thing. But it was just really goofy because you don't really have any power to enforce any of these regulations. I remember one that got really heated was something like, should we allow category 4 sex offenders? I don't know the exact term, but apparently there are gradations of sex offense.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Should we allow them in the camp? And it was just you have no way of knowing.
Yeah.
People come and go.
It's like the Occupy's version of paper please law, kind of.
So it was got lost in the minutia a little bit. Didn't have enough laser focus on
the Alex Williams and Nick Schneer's book, Inventing the Future, calls this the problem of folk politics, which has dominated left discourse for 30, 40 years, which they call folk politics as this desire for immediacy, horizontalism, but no real kind of strategic aim and a lack of focus, and that the street politics never builds to a path to power. And that's the critique they provide. And I think Occupy is part of an anti-nuclear movement. Of course, Jesse and I were involved with the Iraq War movement. That's when we both got politically involved back in 2003. And it was following these kinds of rituals of protest, but without a path to power.
Yeah, I don't know why it developed that way. I think obviously it was a big anarchist aspect of it. I was living in an anarchist house at that point. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it did remind me to some degree of house meetings and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But it makes more sense in the context of a house because you can kind of get people to, do their chores and whatever.
Right. Yes, exactly. Right. You can make jokes and shame them in cute ways.
But the rules in the camp, you don't have police power inside the camp. So why are we making rules at all? And some of them were even totally unknowable rules. You couldn't even know if someone was breaking them or not.
Some of it, too, I felt was this desire to create cultures of purity rather than transform things that are raw and that are awkward. And you're saying, let's kick these people out and kick that people out is one of the problems I felt which is humans are going to come in flawed and they're not necessarily going to come out less flawed, but we still have to have social transformation. And I think that was something that was said. Once again, I loved some of the anarchist principles, but it was so relentlessly horizontal that I started to see limits to that when organizing.
Yeah. I don't know if horizontalism can succeed or not, but certainly that kind of horizontalism fixated specifically on, I guess, what you would call prefigurative politics. That can never transform society generally. I don't think, even if it's useful as part, it can't be the exclusive thing.
Right. It can't be the transformative mechanism that alters society for the better necessarily on its own. And I think that's where in Alex Williams and Nick Cernak's analysis of what they term folk politics, they don't cast it aside outright and they don't dismiss horizontalism outright. They said there's great value in that. And but the prefigurative politics of just practicing that in the square isn't necessarily a path towards power or a path towards broad social change. I think in houses, right, when you have small groups, and in the workplace, definitely, the more you can practice horizontalism and work out the minutia of how does that actually work with small groups, that's actually really good work to be doing. But that's a different thing than how do we transform the hegemonic paradigm and how do we make a new common sense. So we had a discussion about this book, Inventing the Future, and in part of their analysis and prescription for solutions is the notion of borrowing from the blueprint of the neoliberals and the neoliberal project. Like, how did the neoliberal project become the air that we breathe and the water that we drink? How did that come to dominate our landscape and our world? And their analysis, part of that is through think tanks and through dissemination of policy ideas and ideology. And so part of their prescription is, well, we need some of this. We need some left think tanks. We need to maybe mirror some of those or borrow some of that toolkit. So we're curious whether or not that text is something that you've read, if that was informative to you at all, or if that analysis has been informative in your approach to your work and the projects that you're working on now.
No, I mean, I haven't read that book, and I haven't really read any treatment of think tanks more generally. What I did notice, and one of the impetus for doing this was during the 2016 campaign, none of the think tanks would work with Bernie Sanders. And the reason for that, in significant part, was really that they had professional incentive to, align with Clinton. Maybe they can get administrative jobs. A lot of the think tank people are trying to eventually get into an administration. And it was kind of funny because you would talk to all these people and you would swear that like every job in the administration had been promised 5-10 times.
Right.
And they all believed they were going to get it. And then there were just other aspects of these political social networks kind of form in DC, and that's just sort of part of your group. And you want the politicians that you've been working with and know well, familiar with, to win, because that's going to be better for you, better for your organization. What you're selling as a think tank, you're selling to donors. The fact that you have access to politicians, that's really kind of the currency of how that sort of transaction works on a market basis. So it doesn't help to get politicians in power that you don't necessarily have good relationships with. So anyways, the upshot was Bernie had no policy support whatsoever, even though you would talk to some of the rank and file people in these organizations, just like normal policy people. And a lot of them would be, if not explicitly pro-Bernie, they would be favorable to certainly some of his policies.
Did folks feel frustrated by the funding mechanism that was obviously divorcing them from social change? Like, people inside these think tanks, like let's say Demos or things like other think tanks where they obliquely look like progressive or left-leaning organizations, but the institutional funding and the promise of administrative positions makes them move to the seats of enthroned power. So was there a frustration did people say, like, geez, I wish we could work with Bernie more?
There was. I mean, I wasn't the only one that was laid off during this period. I know some other people, I won't name them because they're not interested in being public, but there are people that were frustrated with it. And there are people, what seems to happen if you look at the life cycle of a think tank person is they'll come in and they'll either sort of slowly get with the program and kind of be and convince themselves, well, this is actually the most practical way to do it. Yes, it's compromise. Yes, I'm not like putting out my favorite policy per se, but it is better. And there's no alternative, basically.
There's no alternative. Tina.
Well, speaking of Tina, there's a great blog post by the great
filmmaker,
documentarian Adam Curtis, BBC documentarian, where he states the following about think tanks. This is in a 2011 blog post that he has these video clips of the first real British think tank. He said, think tanks surround politics today and are the very things that are supposed to generate new ideas. But if you go back and look at how they rose up at who invented them and why, you discover they are not quite what they seem. That in reality, they have nothing to do with genuinely developing new ideas, but have become a branch of the PR industry whose aim is to do the very opposite, to endlessly prop up and reinforce today's accepted political wisdom. So successful have they been that in this task that many think tanks have actually become serious obstacles to really thinking about new and inspiring visions of how to change society for the better. And so would you say 3P and the People's Policy Project is an attempt to right that ship?
Yeah. I mean, by getting a different funding source and by hopefully being the kind of person who is sort of, I don't know how you would say it, not smart about playing the game correctly.
Right.
There's an aspect of like, not because I'm particularly courageous, but in part because I'm just like kind of stupid and don't like understand the full social terrain. I just go out with my
You're an accidental savant. So it's like the interesting thing about this is like, well, it's actually a really good funding mechanism idea because number one, it mirrors to me Sanders' campaign funding mechanism, which is broad-based support from progressives donating monthly dues, kind of a due membership system. But also, I mean, Cesar Chavez, the United Food Workers, when it was best was when it had independent, small contributions that balanced out systems of power where they weren't beholden to one special interest. And so to me, it feels like a remarkably smart kind of thing to do.
Yeah, it's certainly a very liberating kind of donation stream. You don't have big donors, so you don't have a particular person you need to worry about. Like if someone gets pissed off, okay, well, you can cancel your membership. It's really not a big deal to me. And, I hope you don't, but it's not going to kill me. So there's a lot of freedom that develops to just be like, I can pretty much do whatever I want. And as long as it's not really awful and cause a mass exodus of patrons, it's basically fine. So if you trust that I'm going to do good things and hopefully my track record of just laying it all out there, even when it's not in my own professional interest, it has created some of that trust, then, it's sort of it's almost a dream of people say, well, we wouldn't it be great if you had a think tank for the poor or whatever, but they don't have money. And it's well, I can kind of be that because I have my own funding and I'm accountable to no one.
We were talking about this morning, but this is what's great about doing podcasts too, is no censorship. We can do whatever the fuck we want currently, right? This is the moment, at least in the landscape, that we hope survives where
I can say I breastfed baby Jesus and no one can do anything about it. I was there. There. It's my podcast. I am the mother of the Lord.
We can be overtly anti-capitalist as much as we want.
And I think that's what you're probably experiencing sounds like with the think tank is I think what's key is it's $5 to $15 donations are the suggested amount.
Wait a second. Let's take a step back for a second because we kind of skipped over okay, tell us a little bit about the People's Policy Project, what it is, how you came to start it, what the story is there.
Yeah, okay. So when I was in law school, I was a blogger at mattbrunig.com, and I had no intent. I'd started the blog quite totally honestly in the summer. One summer, I was very bored. I didn't have anything to do, and so I just started writing on it, and it got popular, and it turns out it's not actually that difficult to produce think tank level reports with the graphs and the figures and stuff, or at least for someone like me. And I already knew how to code and stuff, so I didn't have a hard time.
You had the skill sets.
Yeah, I had the skill sets for really random reasons. The reason I learned to code is because when I was a teenager, my video game console had broke and we didn't have any money, and I just
accidental.
In Linux, and so yeah, a lot of it has been very accidental, but. Anyway, so Demos think tank, this was in the period where think tanks were we need bloggers. That's the thing, is blogging. And they're they hired me to do that for them, just kind of move my stuff over there. And I did that for a few years. And when I came out of law school, they actually offered me a full-time, you can be a real full-blown think tanker. And I was no, thank you. I really not like to be that. It sounds terrible from what I've seen, but I'll keep blogging for you, and I have this other job, and that was my strategy for the kind of freedom that I now have regained because I had another job. So who cares? It's not going to kill me if I say something that gets me, in trouble.
So were you working for the National Review Board or National Labor Review Board? Could you explain about the work you're doing as a lawyer?
Yeah, so I graduated law school in 2014, and I while I was in law school, I focused on labor law, and I worked for a couple of labor unions, clerking and whatnot. And the National Labor Relations Board has an honors attorney program. All the federal agencies do. Basically, they pick high performing students straight out of law school, and you go into the agency and you're on a 2-year fellowship. And if you get past that 2 years, they can retain you or not retain you depending on their budget situation and whatnot. But you learn a lot, and often you can get a job elsewhere if they don't retain you. So I was working there, and then I was also writing at Demos at night on my free, which was permitted by the government rules. We're fine with that. Yeah, so that was the situation I was in, and then in May of 2016, I tweeted a tweet that I think said, "Scumbag Neera uses welfare when she needs it, but takes away from others when they
need it."
When they need it, yeah.
Reference to the Clinton administration, right? In terms of welfare to work kind of thing.
Right. She worked for the Clinton administration during that period, and Scumbag Neera is a reference to Scumbag Steve, which is a meme that some people know, but others don't. And it's actually a proper use of that meme.
You capitalized it. That's what I noticed. So it was obviously used as a term.
Yeah.
But you had to put the quotation mark around it, right? The scare quotes. But I mean, that's the...
I should have done the meme template with the little image.
Exactly. See, there's appropriate versions of ridicule or debate, and then there's inappropriate ones. And I think that speaks to what I call, Twitter as the Kafkaesque gulag, right? Because people have, lost work as a result of tweeting. So like Reza Aslan called Donald Trump a piece of shit in a tweet and, lost his job within an hour or 2 hours, right? And, some of the weird things about these structures, like for me, if I were to do a tweet, well, I'm part of a union at UCR as a lecturer union. So I have some of these kind of protections. Do you think that Twitter's not just an issue about free speech, but also like the kinds of protections we do or don't have at work?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the funny or somewhat ironic aspects of so the short story is I got fired for that tweet at Demos, and that also had some knock-on effects for my employment at the NLRB.
You had to GoFundMe for this, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I was in a probationary period at the NLRB, and so it wasn't good. But while I was at the NLRB, one of the big things we worked on was social media rights for workers, because there are some interesting aspects of the National Labor Relations Act, which actually, as interpreted by the NLRB while I was there, like they were making new law on this, says that you have rights to tweet and share things on Facebook that are related to your job in certain ways. So just like previously, you would have had a right to get with your coworkers and go to a news reporter and say, hey, we have this issue, and then they write a story about it. And then if your boss fires you, they can't do that. That would be, they extend that logic to social media. And so,
The thing that I think is interesting about it is that this division between work and your personal life has been such that your job now haunts you in your personal media life. And I think that's the most unsettling thing is that, well, don't you have a right to personal feelings and personal sentiments? And so somehow when you speak for Demos. I mean, this is a structural thing that I think is weird.
No, we're not people. We're not human beings.
Exactly.
We have rights to things like healthcare and or food or anything, or a safe place to sleep at night. We don't have rights to those sorts of things. We just need to make sure we're to work on time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
There's a bizarre kind of circularity to the way people talk about it, where they're like, well, your tweets kind of do represent Demos or, Demos employer. And so they have to act. And it's like, well, if we all decide they don't represent Demos, then they don't have to act, right? Like at some level, you choose to equate me with Demos, and that then is your justification for me being terminated. But if you would just stop choosing that, then Demos would be like, what the hell are you talking about? He's just tweeting. People tweet, they say things, they go to parties and say things like that. We just don't deal with that.
And because of this whole controversy, you created a GoFundMe account, which I thought was really moving because you obviously weren't asking for like billions of dollars, but when you reached the threshold of when you had funding from the support system that was in solidarity with you, you posted something about a guy named Eric Harwood. And I thought this was an interesting kind of sense of class solidarity. Even though he has different political views in some regards in terms of immigrants and refugees, you actually said for folks to donate to him. Could you talk about his relationship to you and how you felt more connected from this sense of unemployment?
Yeah. Actually, I intended to do a follow-up with him, and you just now reminded me that I need to do that. I didn't have a chance to do that because I was frozen offline for 6 months, but Eric Harwood is this guy that I saw on Twitter. I follow the Social Security Administration on Twitter, and they tweet out, anodyne, just whatever. And he responded to one of their tweets saying, I don't know, basically complaining and whatever, and linking to a YouTube video. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I love weird internet stuff. And
mm-hmm.
Someone who's linking to YouTube videos of themselves to the Social Security Administration, crazy or whatever. And so I went and watched the YouTube video. And the videos are awful, and you really feel for the guy. And he basically unfolds the story where he's been working for many years as a locksmith, and then he develops back pain, really bad back pain. Mm-hmm. And he used to work as a trucker, and that's not uncommon with truckers because they sit for so long and mm-hmm. the vehicles vibrate. And he basically couldn't walk, and he had back and leg problems and whatever. And he had tried to get his Social Security disability insurance, and he had been denied it. And he was kind of at his wit's end, and he had 3 or 4 videos, and his life is just falling apart. And you start seeing boxes pile up behind him because he's trying to move. And,
it's a Brazil, Terry Gomes, Brazil or something, right?
Yeah, it was nuts. And so I contacted him and asked him if I could just, basically do a story about him on my blog where I just basically what are the facts of what's going on, mm-hmm. and let me tell what your situation is. Oh, and also in the videos he was a Trump supporter. And I thought that was interesting.
But the interesting thing is he had a real class critique, which is that, the fallen of America, working class, and it doesn't have to be specifically race, but just working class folks have been duped by the government. And so there is an anti-authoritarian critique, even though he blames the wrong sorts of people beyond the government, right?
That's how it turns out. And I follow a lot of right-wing pages on Facebook, and you see this in those as well. There's a mixture of, really awful stuff on the right, and then you see people who they basically have a really bad economic situation, and they're convinced that the reason for that is because the government is spending too much on,
foreign aid, right? It was less than 1%.
Foreign aid, right? That's the thing, and obviously they're being messaged that somewhere, and it's actually a very insignificant portion of expenditure, but that's kind of how they deal with it. And he was one of those people.
I think that's what's interesting between the right and the left is causation. So
the desires are shared.
Yeah,
human desires.
The anger and the sentiment
for well-being,
about the unfairness of society.
Yeah, but where does the injustice? Where's the cause of injustice?
Yeah. And so you guys were both unemployed at the same time in some ways, and so it was kind of interesting that he became more visceral, that you decided to hey, go to his GoFundMe page, which isn't up anymore when I checked. But I thought that was interesting that you made that emotional connection. I have enough, let's help him out.
Yeah. And I had done a blog post about him and had linked the GoFundMe on that. And he had gotten quite a few donations initially. And what had happened with my GoFundMe, I had set it at 10,000. And 3 hours after I had put it up, it was at 25,000. So I shut it down because I don't, in retrospect, I wonder if I should have, but I thought, it starts to look a little weird when it's over the weekend I've raised $100,000 off of this, and then I'm am I George Zimmerman? I don't want to do that. So
time it with the People's Policy Project. It's you have a transition, right? But
right.
So the People's Policy Project kind of came out from this, let me create a think tank that I actually can believe in and that I really want to work at, or create a think tank that does have a socialist horizon.
Yeah, well, so there were a lot of people, even right after I was let go, that was are you going to do Patreon? Are you going to do Patreon? And at the time I was, no, I'm going to get a new law job, mm-hmm. And I didn't end up being able to get a new law job. And I also didn't think I'd be able to do that well on Patreon because the success stories have proprietary content. They're podcasts. They're kind of entertaining and whatever. Mm-hmm. And my stuff is, I wouldn't say that entertaining. The Twitter is, I think, more entertaining than my actual content that I put out. And so, so I kind of sat on that for a while. And I started talking to people and I thought, well, instead of just being support Matt Bruenig, intrepid voice or whatever, maybe it would be better if I was support an institution that I'm making and I'll pay all these other people and we'll have more contributors and so on. Mm-hmm. And I talked around and I spoke to a lot of people about, should we do this? Does it make sense? Does it work? And then I launched it, and yeah, it has been working.
So you said, why don't we just have a transitional form, but also a larger systemic aim? You're linking into actual, maybe possibly policy outcomes. I mean, is that kind of the goals, that it's not just that you want to organize a different structure? So right now you have 1,600 supporters. If it gets bigger, which I was surprised how many donations.
One of them here, supporter here.
Yeah. If it gets bigger, you're going to have to hire folks, and you probably have already hired some people to write on the account. And it looks like from the website, you've got some other writers. So will it take a different structural form? Like if this think tank develops a real support, will you look at the way it's democratized itself?
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm the only person in it, so I don't have to think about organizational form exactly. You know, in the short term, the amount of money we have is a lot for an individual, but not a lot for organization. So the way I have it set up is to try to pay out freelancers as much as possible. We've had 4 outside contributors. I have like 5 or 6 that I'm working with drafts and stuff on right now. And then I get a video coming, and it's like, so right now it works because I can just pay contractors kind of piece by piece for any surplus. And then, but as it gets bigger, then it does become possible to have full-time employees, and that'll, will be what I do if I get to that level.
Would you want it to have a kind of a unitary cooperative model if it does scale up to actually embody the kind of democracy you and I would probably want?
Well, I haven't thought a lot about forms right now. I mean, the form that I opted for was just the most minimal legal entity possible just to get it going. So I have a disregarded entity LLC. You can file a few forms and make it. If I get bigger, I will eventually probably want to do 501c3, and then you have to do all sorts of articles of incorporation and rules, and so yeah, I don't know what that'll look like. I hadn't really thought a lot through that at this point, but
yeah, you might be doing more advocacy as a think tank. I don't know if think tanks typically fall under a 501c4, but yeah, when you scale up, you have to think of that.
Yeah. And also there is some advantages to maintaining the current entity, which is, it basically operates as a media company. And so we do have somewhat more freedom, because media companies can be totally open about endorsing people and endorsing things and that sort of stuff. So, and the real benefits of a nonprofit are tax deductibility of donations, which is not relevant for as long as people are donating very small sums. So it might make sense to create, I guess, what they call B Corps, these social purpose corporations that are still technically for profit, but basically don't operate that way.
I wish there was a coloring book for this shit, because my group, I have a group called the 28ers, which is asking for a 28th Amendment to U.S. Constitution to create exclusive public financing for all federal elections. And, I had to do a lot of research, was I a 501c3 or 501c4? We're asking for a 20th Amendment. We do monthly events. So I sometimes wish, just when you're doing organizational forms, give me a coloring book and something, or, fucking cartoon characters.
Make it a little simpler.
I'm confused. Yeah. I could never be a lawyer because I really wouldn't be able to hedge through that jargon that goes along with it.
Yeah, the weight of the bureaucracy.
Exactly, literally the weight of it. I mean, yeah, pantomime this stuff out for me.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of like minutia. Why I gravitate towards the whole thing. So I kind of found it interesting. How does this work? There's C Corps and S Corps and LLCs and disregarded entities and
nerdgasm.
So, I mean, toward that end, so why a think tank? Why call what you're doing a think tank? It sounds like you say it's basically a media company. You could call it something else the way that it's currently structured. So what's the purpose there in clearly the content is think tank type of content, policy stuff, but are there aims that you have that are to transform what is possible for a think tank?
So I call myself a think tank because I want to be regarded in the same set as Center for American Progress and Economic Policy Institute and that sort of thing. And that's really how I operate more realistically. But if it was we're a competing media company, for starters, no one interviews, Vox isn't quoting me on something if I'm a competitor to Vox in the media space. It's wouldn't make any sense. New York Times isn't like, hey, well, let's get Matt Bloomberg to write a piece. It's like, well, if they're our competitor, why did we get them to write a piece?
Well, there's also just like a huge need because there is, I mean, it's an overtly anti-capitalist socialist think tank. I can't think of any.
Would you say that? So that's a question I had is like, so I've been really jazzed about this project of yours. The day you launched the People's Policy Project, I was like, oh, fucking awesome.
That's just right out of Inventing the Future.
Yeah, I was like, oh, exactly. I've been waiting for this.
Because that's one of the 3 or 4 things they ask for. Yeah. Alex Williams and Nick Schernick ask for this think tank.
But in my evangelizing about your project, I've often described it as I've prescribed the term anti-capitalist to your project, but that isn't your language. That's how my read on it. And so I was curious about.
We described it, or I described it on the About page as a think tank dedicated to socialist and social democratic.
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, these terms get bandied around, so it becomes difficult. I would say social democracy and socialism are anti-capitalist forms, are motivated by anti-capitalism. I don't know if particular policies are always necessarily capitalist. I don't know. Is the welfare state anti-capitalist? People disagree on that. Certainly, I would think some of my plans to like socialize ownership of equity and bonds and capital, I would think that would tend towards the yes, that counts. But even some people say that doesn't count either. It's too financialized.
So you're not really sectarian about it. You're just like looking. I mean, one of the arguments you can make about a think tank is here's policies and policy outcomes. So we did a podcast on Michael Moore's Where to Invade Next, and what was so brilliant about it is it didn't really talk about politics or ideology or labels. It just says, well, here's policies and here are policy outcomes. Right. So the benefit of not being sectarian, and of course it doesn't seem like you're identifying yourself as one particular socialist branch, is you can look at policies and policy outcomes based on data. I mean, that would be a benefit.
That's the register I think you want to speak in for this purpose. I mean, if you want to get treated seriously, and a big part of the think tank world is getting sort of PR into other publications, it doesn't make sense to be like, here's the updated, Trotskyist, whatever.
Yeah. Right.
That just doesn't, it's just like, well, no, here's some ideas that tend towards socialization, more social control over the income distribution, over ownership, and these are practical and they work and they're good, and you should cover them in the vein that they work and they're good, and I've planned it out and it's good to go, not in the vein of that this does fit with the socialist idea, or this doesn't.
As you say in the About section, we are, as the name suggests, the People's Policy Project, not Walmart's policy project, and not the Gates Foundation policy project, which is hilarious because Warren Buffett and Gates keep telling us they're philanthropists, but they keep holding on to all their fucking money. It's like, I'm on the billionaire list, but it's like, well, go to givedirectly.org or .com and get rid of your shit. And it's just absurd that these think tanks are supposed to be about economic liberation and keep holding on to the money. And I think what's great is like People's Policy Project, right? It's not really partisan in the nature of saying it's for the people. And so is this think tank organized around a kind of economic big tent vision, or are there other systems of oppression that think tank will focus on?
So the big thing I'm trying to fill holes. That's really because I don't want to duplicate stuff, and that gets a little tricky because there have been some ideas that I think I was a leader on at one point at Demos that have now been picked up by other think tanks, and I feel a little bit like that was my thing. Whatever. I just gotta let it go because it doesn't make sense. If they're working on it, why waste my time?
So they took your jazz tune. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that might happen. That's a good thing if it happens, but it doesn't start to limit. But anyway, it's like, so that then opens up the door for, maybe some foreign policy stuff, maybe some immigration policy stuff, maybe some areas that are not. And foreign policy is the most natural area that really is basically entirely neglected outside of Institute for Policy Studies on the left. Cap dabbles in it, but not in a good way.
I mean, so one thing I would love to see more, and this is probably a prompt for your think tank, is like, okay, so the suggested budget now by the Republicans for the defense budget, which a lot of the Democrats are just jumping on the back for, is about $700 billion for defense spending this year. And, no think tanks ever say, hey, what if we were to do a redistribution of the budget towards these certain things? What would the outcomes be on these issues? So like universal basic income, what if we took about half of that and moved that in basic income? What would be the economic effects?
How do we phase out that spending?
I think this is what's really needed in think tanks is like tell us about the shit we're spending and what would happen if we moved into other parts of the economy.
Yeah. I had a post at Demos actually where I looked at how much money would you have to give to eliminate poverty, like if you were just to kind of top off the poor, like where they are. And that wouldn't be a super practical policy, but just for conceptualizing the scale of the problem. And then I compared that to the military budget, and it was like a small fraction of it. And so I've done that before, but I haven't really since.
Well, there's just some really obvious things that are just absurdly gross. Like also $600 million easily, and that doesn't include all of the military budget because the nuclear stuff's, in a different department, right? Department of Interior. So that's not even part of the military budget, but it kind of is. But, $65 billion for tuition for education, and we're spending $600 billion for military. So like that needs to be drawn out more, and it isn't really.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And I actually I'm already bubbling up ways to do it in ways that are validating to other people. Because what you can do is you can look at what percent of GDP other countries dedicate to military spending. Yes. And say, well, if we dedicated a similar amount of our GDP to that, that would leave, 2 to 3 points of GDP would come free that would be able to spend on blah, blah, blah. And there you go.
There are some things where you see this cropping up. Like I think it was a Stanford study that said if we have institute universal basic income, it would create $1.5 trillion of economic growth or value if we just actually adopted UBI. So my hope is, and I'm hoping too, that you use some of the things that already exist and ask, what would the effects of it be?
I mean, actually, I just tweeted a link to your Medium post from last year about the basic income that the 1% already has, and how that the 1% gets basically a basic income that's 7.5 times that the annual income of the average American.
Yeah, and I am actually going to flesh that out a little bit. And if you saw the Vox interview with Hillary Clinton, she actually looked like that. But what I think we're going to end up doing,
she invented universal basic income, I'm told.
What I think we're going to do is rebrand the basic income that I support and generally argue for, which is also supported by some European socialist organizations, involves basically buying up capital and then using the return on capital to pay out a dividend in equal sums to people. And so what I think we're going to end up doing is rebranding it as universal basic dividend, which is what some of the pan-European socialist organizations now call it, in order to distinguish it from this, in the welfare state and repackage all the money, kind of Silicon Valley style.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good idea. I really like that notion because there's also, with the term income, it's the association with work still.
Yes.
Right? And that's that is a link that needs to be broken because if our horizon line for an envisioned better future includes a decrease in work, or the drudgery of work at least, or the end of work altogether, as we might hope for or dream of, then I think that's a good reframing and a necessary reframing. And the one place in the States that has this sort of wealth fund dividend I grew up in, so in Alaska. So I experienced that.
And it was
and it's just called a dividend. So there's no confusion there.
At the height of the oil boom, I think it was $1,500 a year.
Yeah, I mean, it spiked around
but a lot, for some folks.
It's gotten as high as $3,000 a year per person. So $12,000 for a family of four. And they do call it, the permanent fund dividend. And I think it's very useful because once you call it a dividend, then it's just like, you can just be like, well, but we already pay out dividends to very wealthy people. Why not pay them out to all?
You're essentially,
people, some of that's earnings and paychecks and stuff,
Right.
Well, you're essentially using financial capital language for the people. I mean, it's a readoption of those terms towards us. Like, hey, we're part of the investor class too, motherfuckers. It's called dividends. And so it's actually an interesting reframing because it's saying like, well, yeah, we're part of the stock market too, so give us our dividends.
Right. So that's one area, is the redistribution of wealth and possibly a policy position that, like you said, phrases a redistribution of these dividends that are going to the 1% to everyone. But if you were to, say, draft up a manifesto, a la the Labour Party manifesto from earlier this year, as a complete set of policy ideas, like a prescription for the near future at a national level, what do you think goes in that kind of document for you?
Yeah, so I like to divide economic issues roughly into three areas. You have welfare. And there, building out a Nordic welfare state is how you deal with that. They have the best welfare system in the world. So that's going to mean paid leave. That's going to mean childcare. That's going to mean free college. That's going to mean a number of other welfare benefits that are currently non-existent in our system. So build out like a real social democratic welfare state. Then the second area is labor. And for labor, you're going to want unionization, much more, strong unionization. We have one of the lowest unionization rates in the developed world. There are all sorts of ideas about how to do that, including to create sectoral unions as opposed to what are called establishment level unions that we have now. But make the labor market more highly organized, minimum wages, higher taxes on higher earners in order to compress the wage distribution. And then when it comes to capital, my idea on capital, although I'm open to other plans, is the social wealth fund approach that Alaska has, but just on a much more massive level. So basically, you impose wealth taxes, or you use some other financing mechanisms to build out a social wealth fund, and then you repackage the returns from that fund as dividends. And so in that way, you kind of socialize the means of production by using the financial machinery we've already built up.
Right.
So that's sort of my general vision is for those three areas: Nordic welfare state, highly organized labor market, and then gradual socialization through this social wealth fund of capital.
Now, so the capital, the third point of that, the capital and the social wealth fund, is that wholly distinct from, a Nordic welfare state, a system of social welfare?
So the Nordic states do use social wealth funds. Certainly, most famously, Norway has a social wealth fund that is
like
just reached $1 trillion in value.
So it's about $250,000 per person in Norway, right? Is that what it is as a retirement fund?
And if you look at per capita household wealth in the U.S., so this is per person, is $220,000. So Norway's wealth fund would be equivalent to if you nationalized all the wealth in the United States into a social wealth fund.
Wow.
Of course, they've benefited from oil and
69% tax rate on the oil, right? Too, right? So that's got to happen.
75, I think, when you include some of the other, like if you put it all together. But yeah, well, it's not only 75% tax rate on on oil corporate profits, but they also own State Oil, which is their major oil company.
Yeah.
So they have direct line to those revenues. So yeah, so they have that. They also own a third. Norway owns 1/3 of the Oslo Stock Exchange. They own 1/3 of basically domestic industry, which is more than private Norwegians own of domestic industry. The rest comes from foreign capital. And they also have a generous welfare state. So it's definitely compatible, but they're kind of conceptually different. They don't necessarily use the wealth funds to feed the welfare state per se. Like it's just revenue for them.
Right. So it's sort of separate sort of pools of funding.
Yeah. And I mean, they have payroll taxes basically that would be conceived of as being what funds the welfare state. Obviously, all money is fungible. And so what funds what is sort of up in the air, but that's kind of conceptually how they do it. Just like we fund Social Security or Medicare and we think, oh, it's our taxes on, we look at our pay stub. That's what's funding that. And that's really how their welfare state is funded as well, in large part.
So if these three things, the creation of a Nordic-style welfare state, unionization and support for labor, redistribution of capital through social wealth funds, these three big sort of areas, and you have policy directions detailing these, what does it look like for you imagining a path towards adoption and a path towards power in the hands of those who would hold public office?
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of think of our role as we put together actionable policy so that it's there, and really it's going to be up to organization to put people in power who can draw upon that. Yeah, I don't believe enough in the discourse to say that, we put out really good papers and we have really good statistics and estimates of how this is going to play out, and that's going to persuade people. It's more like, we now have the ability to do this if we can get power, and it's going to be up to other organizations to get people in power. And they're way better at that than I am. So
on our podcast, Jesse came up with this idea of coming up with a 7-point platform, which we jokingly called just on the spot, the Slingshot 7. And these are policies, prescriptions that have a tactical kind of element.
Right.
So like healthcare for all, renewable energy plan toward 100% usage. That's number 2. Universal basic income, or UBI for all. We could call it UBD, as we talked about. A demilitarization, both domestic and foreign. Tuition-free education. A big one for me, of course, is getting money out of politics. That's 6. And the 7th one is 15-hour minimum wage adjusted to inflation, so we don't have to keep revisiting the issue. So these are like things that we're working on too, is what do those look like as policy points, right? Like actionable things.
Right. And then as campaign elements for folks who may...
Signing on to it. I mean, one of the things I think is a missing part of Bernie Sanders' campaign is you certainly can't do a litmus test at the point we're at right now, but at some point, the progressive socialist Milo should come up with a kind of contract for America, but for these kinds of progressive policies or socialist policies, whatever term you want to use, is that have people be part of some larger social movement, and that involves 7 categories or something else like that. I mean, that's what I loved about the manifesto with the Labor Party. It was so easy to read. It was so obvious. It was clearly outlined. And so I'm hoping, exactly like you said, those 3 core components can be flown into these actionable things.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, there's also a difference between sort of tagline demands and the nitty-gritty details. And I think even the development of the tagline demands is something that, I mean, I can take a stab at, but there are other people who are better at it. So that's more of a for an organizer mindset, I think.
Right.
We'll give that up to the Bernie dank meme staff. I just give it up to the memers.
No, I mean, I think this is why it has excited me so much about the launch of your project and the work that you've been doing, is that this is absolutely what's necessary and needed, is this supporting element in the whole matrix, in the ecosystem of a path towards power for the left and for people, for the many and not the few, is... Someone like you needs to be into the minutia, right? Because there are folks like Matt who's not, can't get excited by that.
I teach argument and rhetoric. I'm not going to go through LLC and all that. Yeah, exactly. So there's different skill sets.
Then there's folks like me who I'm not necessarily in either of those, but I like to package that all up into something that can be a tagline and that can be sold, right? What I'm excited about, and also with the especially post-election, the growth and the influx into
DSA,
the Democratic Socialists of America, for instance, is that if these things are happening, if projects like yours are being successful and actually informing the discourse, right, and providing the necessary detailed analysis so that folks can make arguments in the
public sphere. Yeah, right? I mean, this is what think tanks did: is they created legitimacy for crazy ideas that then were treated as common sense because. Right. We had all these legitimate authorities from universities and faculty that are bought off by, these libertarian funders. We have our own version of that, which is like we're creating a new common sense, to borrow the Inventing the Future framework, is that if your think tank becomes a way that we legitimize these ideas.
Yeah, it's important. I mean, even if the discourse doesn't drive like rank and file organization, it does, determine what is credible and not credible among kind of this media sphere, which is also, closely connected into this political sphere. And the media reporters, for the most part, they're not really able to determine what is a legitimate report and what isn't. It's very brand heavy. It's like, well, this thing came from this organization. They're very serious and so on. So
they're inconsistent about saying left or right leaning. I mean, this is one thing that annoys the fuck out of me is journalists do or don't say, hey, these are left or right-leaning organization, and they're not consistent about it. So I was like, okay, well, this is a think tank. It must be right because you haven't said if it's left or right-leaning. But, that's...
Well, there's no acknowledgement of the motivations behind...
Yes.
Right.
Who's funding them, right? Yeah, exactly.
Right, yeah. Determining their lean is not helpful for a specific topic. Like, why are they commenting on this? Are they commenting on this because they're left-leaning, or are they commenting on this because... they have a particular grant.
Well, that's the strength of the People's Policy Project is it's from the people. So people are going to say, okay, the class alignment is like, yeah, you're a think tank, but you're being funded by small donations of everyday people,
$5 a month,
just like Bernie Sanders. And so you can keep saying, if you want, Matt, you can say $5, like Bernie Sanders, $27. We're funded by $5.
If I can ever get into and I think I've been mentioned in a few publications, and people are asking me for comments and stuff now. So it's like the ball is rolling for that like level. But I think it is going to be an interesting, if I clash with a think tank at some point, which I'm sure I will.
Then you know you've made it. You know you've made it, right?
To be like, well, look at their donors.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's the core reason is like you could probably at some point get grants and funding, but it seems like the funding mechanism, which you said is accidental, is actually really brilliant because it actually represents the term of the think tank, which is people, and it's funded by people.
Yeah, that was I threw that out on the Patreon. I was like, what should we call this? And someone came up with that term, and I was like, that's genius because it's like the people, the populace, and also how it's funded. Oh, that's real clever. So I didn't come up with
if the People's Party ever gets its roots from under its obsession with Bernie Sanders.
Right, moves beyond their celebrity obsession with Bernie Sanders.
Then there'll be some confusion about like, are you part of the People's Party because you're the People's Policy Project? But I mean, I think the good thing about this is there's a clear class alignment here where it is funded by small donors.
So you feel like it's been successful since launch? The work that you've been doing, what sort of traction has that had thus far?
Yeah, so judging it is a little tough. I mean, I think if you use normal think tank metrics, they're really interested in have politicians paid attention. And I have gotten tweets from Ro Khanna, congressman from Valley. I've gotten tweets from Keith Ellison. And I got my first tweet from Bernie Sanders on Wednesday.
Nice.
Actually, a retweet of someone else's tweet, but I think that counts. So, have gotten traction there. And I do actually know people in these staffers and stuff. I already knew some of them already. And so they are interested and they talk to me and that sort of thing. And then on top of that, I've had media hits. Vox has quoted me. Vice has quoted me. Roll Call has quoted me. So I think it's a good start.
And you just had a really interesting post on Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All. I think you just posted it on the People's Policy.
Yeah, really nice summary of the bill.
Yeah, there was no good summary. I was quite shocked. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be, but there was a lot of what seemed to have been pre-written pieces where they just kind of dropped in a paragraph of detail. Just like, here's the whole thing. Like that should be what Vox does. Like that's their niche, but they didn't actually do that. So I figured I would, and it's become the thing. Joy Reid tweeted it out. Actually, not a fan.
Oh my God! Oh my! Like, strange bedfellows.
Yeah.
And then maybe Joan Walsh will retweet it too. I mean, who knows what's possible?
It's good to be the definitive account, even among people who are opponents of it. So,
do you agree with this gradualist approach that Sanders is using? Is it smart, or or do people will feel sold out that it's breaking Medicare for all into certain segments?
Well, yeah, I guess it's I don't know if his counts as gradualist or not. I guess it is because there's a 4-year phase in, but it's not. It's less gradualist than almost any other proposal.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I don't know that I have. I'm open, I guess, to different paths to getting there as long as we're trying to get there. I think the difference that you really have had in the primary and also just amongst kind of centrists and leftists more generally is the centrist position has been we need to shore up this public-private arrangement we have. And so we have some ideas where the public could get involved to make this arrangement more viable. And I think the left position needs to be, well, we're willing to maintain private insurance for as long as necessary, but we're getting rid of it, like one way or another, like we're getting rid of it, as opposed to necessarily being like, it's got to be done in a year or 2 years or 3 years.
Well, you're seeing the left organize pretty effectively on healthcare because it's part of the general national conversation. You have California's SB 562. I don't know if you're familiar with that law, but the fact that Anthony Redden, who now has a recall petition, has created a blue ribbon bullshit committee to talk about universal health care tells you that we've changed the horizon of the conversation to universal coverage, which is their bullshit way of avoiding single payer, but is another example of the left actually starting to get stuff.
Yeah. Well, and I think the way that the sort of federal dialectic is turning is there was a great article in Politico about Chris Murphy's bill. And he says, this is a better way to get to single payer. And it's like, that's great. Like that is literally now the alternative position is here's a more like reasonable gradualist path to single payer as opposed to here's how we can shore up our existing system. And then it's like, that's a great thing because even if you lose, the centrist position is still single payer, just more slowly and, through somewhat different paths.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm like, I just want everybody covered. I mean, I know that we're beholden to making these powerful companies larger, but anytime we can just say, look, let's change the framing, which is that healthcare is a human right. And we can talk about the policy forms, but I mean, you and I know, of course, it'll all eventually go to single payer because the cost would be so tremendous. But I think the fact that the left continues to win on that moral argument that everyone has a right to healthcare is profound.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because the old center position, which still is around but seems to be slowly cracking, is they do have a response to that, which is a more complicated explanation of how, well, I do believe it's a right, but I don't necessarily think that requires public insurance. We can cover everyone.
Yeah.
Private and public.
That's what Funder speaking.
Like, I kind of get it. Like, that it's not an insane response, but it's not an effective response.
No, but it is clearly about placating the big pharma and the people that are funding them. I mean, Jerry Brown. Many people think Jerry Brown told Anthony Rendon to block SB 562 in California, and the media is reporting as if SB 562 is dead, and it's not. Washington Post, Politico, when they talk about Medicare for All with Bernie, they assume that issue's dead, and it's really not. I mean, the fact that Rendon's forming a committee will just keep SB 562 in the windmill. So I think this is the interesting thing, is the sense of just tired of bullshit, is you can see it in people's faces.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, even if that bill is, whether it's dead or not, it's clearly moving the discussion.
Yeah.
And like practically, single payer wouldn't be possible in California under Trump anyways, because it requires all these federal waivers and stuff. So
there's folks that say the opposite. There's a guy named Rex Kolnick that says that the waivers that the South used to not have Obamacare is the same waivers we'd be granted based on precedent. So there's an argument that Rendon's been using that, but a lot of healthcare advisors like Michael Leidy says that, actually, this is a precedent. There's a precedent of where it would be allowed, even if a Trump had allowed it to, because ironically, the South was using the waiver policy to not opt in, right? So it's a debate worth having. But I think once again, all of these things are impossible, seemingly, until we make them possible. Yeah. And I think we shouldn't assume anything is impossible.
Well, right. But I guess generally, if you look at the way things are passed, like basically we just need to be ready and get everyone like on board, and then there will be a brief window where there is an actual chance to do it, and you just need to be ready for that window. And things like the California push, whether it succeeds or not, gets us closer to being ready for when. Window.
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually one of the points that's detailed in, again, we highly recommend this book. If you haven't gathered so far, this Inventing the Future book, I highly suggest
Canadian and British authors.
You read it. But is that this is what the neoliberals had, was lying in wait. They had policies ready
40 years
for when there was a window, and a whole support system developed and ideologically infused into those with a path towards power. In the political elite, and so
academics.
It was just a matter of like having it ready to go when there's the opportunity to act on towards it. So is there work in your look ahead for your project to focus more on this healthcare discussion?
Yeah, we're working. I am, and I have some other like people helping me kind of informally on trying to figure out how to do this. Part of the problem is you look at how to put together one of these proposals and really score it. You need access to one of these healthcare models. There are a handful of like proprietary healthcare models that exist.
Oh, shit.
And they're very, it would be very difficult to make one yourself. So basically you want to get access to one of them, and they're very expensive to get access to.
The torrent.
And it's like, and I actually checked to see, are these expensive to get access to because they we own these things and we're just going to like charge whatever we want. Or is it really just difficult? There's a lot of just human labor that goes into producing this. And I thought, well, let's look at the CBO, because the CBO has a model themselves and they have a budget, and you can kind of see how much it costs them to score this ACA stuff that they've been scoring. And it costs them $2 million to score it. And they're not obviously extracting rents or whatever with their models. So, it's looking like, it could be in the realm of hundreds of thousands of dollars to actually get access to one of these models. So I do have a plan for bringing some bringing some of that money in. Sanders is certainly a prolific fundraiser, and he has his own institute now.
Tweet Policy Project.
So you need more of those $5 a month.
Yeah, $5.
Or I think I can coordinate. The plan is to see if I can get a number of organizations on board. People are going to like to have their name attached to this for a very low price as on an individual basis. So
how about just say $5.27? Just combine it, just have that dry hump you with the $5. Just $5.27. Bernie and me. Great.
So where should folks go to
get involved?
Get involved, support, find the work that you're doing?
Yeah, if you just go to the website at peoplespolicyproject.org, and if you wanted to donate, there's on the right sidebar, there's a little widget. You can click Become a Supporter and do it through Patreon, and it's very easy. And Patreon is a good platform. You can cancel at any time, so it's pretty straightforward.
So I was Policy Project curious, but I think I'm going to become one of your contributors. I think every time we have someone on, we're going to be giving up more of our money.
We had an episode with, we talked to a couple of folks about DSA, and I was already a member. And by the end of the discussion, we got to turn Matt into a
I'm
member.
No longer Policy Project curious or 3P curious.
There we go. That's the objective of this podcast, is to get Matt a little more radicalized.
And then we can set up our own Patreon account to pay for all of these other Patreon accounts. but I think the interesting thing is, it seems like that seems to be the strategy is self-funding models. I mean, our friend Franz Pierre is a basic income model that's basically got a Indiegogo account and is hoping to start an educational program to do a pilot program for basic income in LA and talk about how it's affecting people's lives, a kind of local strategy, right? Mm-hmm. So he's also fundraising. So it seems to be pretty common.
Yeah, and Scott Santon's the big basic income. He has a basic income for himself on Patreon. I always thought that was a really genius way to get money.
Yeah.
Test it on me. But yeah, and generally, actually, I think that the success of left-wing crowdfunding and stuff is a good indicator that mainstream sources are really missing a lot of opportunity to a huge crowd of people that would love to read stuff in the New York Times or whatever, and they don't take advantage of that market opportunity.
Millennial self-collectivization. There will be fully automated space anarchy.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I hope your project continues to grow. I hope that at some point soon you have to deal with the problem of the organizational structure, because I think these, as you said, where there are gaps in the discourse and where you're filling in these gaps, I think this is absolutely necessary as we grow towards successes. Hopefully,
yes,
progressive successes for people. And that this is the first of many of efforts of this sort. So, trailblazer.
And we're podcast about solutions, so we're just glad to see someone doing these
solutions minded. Yes,
I love solutions. Whatever works, bipartisan, all the rest of it.
Yes. Yeah. That's why we're not into the tribal bickering
bullshit. Yeah.
Here. Yeah. So. Well, one of the things we usually do include at the end of a conversation is a little clip from someone about a dream about the future. But maybe we thought we'd ask you, if you could summarize shortly what your dream of the future would be.
I think Norway is the future. That's my goal, honestly, in the near term. But yeah, less work, more equal distribution of income, equal distribution of ownership, equal distribution of power inside firms through unions and outside firms through these social ownership relationships, and just a more egalitarian society overall.
Norway's the happiest place on earth. That sounds good.
Well, I'm in solidarity with that. Let's do this work to build that future.
Let's have the U.S. crack into that top 10 of happiest place on earth. I think you're making the call.
Yes, making the call for that. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for joining us today. This was a great pleasure for both of us. And we will leave links to everything. Mm-hmm. And if you are listening and you haven't checked out the show notes, boy, I don't know that anybody beats us on the show notes. And this is all Matt. I help a little bit, but most Matt just goes bonkers on the show notes. So there's
We're
references.
The anti-Rush Limbaugh. Everything we say is cited with fucking evidence.
Yes.
So yeah. And I think that's the main thing.
Yeah,
we cite our shit.
There'll be lengthy show notes for this one. as usual. But if you want to get in contact with us, find us on the internet. You can find us at thefutureisamixtape.com. You can send us an email and we will respond because we're real people.
With low wuffy. We have low wuffy.
You can email us at thefutureisamixtape@gmail.com. Find us on Twitter at Future Mixtapes, on Facebook at facebook.com/thefutureismixtape, on Instagram, wherever. You can find Matt Snyder on Facebook, become his Facebook friend.
Facebook.com/with secret noise.
All right. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great.